Right, everyone, thank you all very much for coming on such a wet and miserable March afternoon. We're back into winter again, but thank you for all being here, and thank you for putting up with us as we battle valiantly against the technology which has bested us, but I think that's a moral victory for us overall. Eloise has very kindly agreed to continue with the lecture in the absence of the magnificent PowerPoint slides. I've seen them, you're missing out. But in their absence, she is going to give us the lecture anyway, and you have the most important image on a handout. Eloise teaches political theory at Oriel College at the moment. She's an intellectual historian by training and vocation, and has done a great deal of work on early modern Venice and its relation to England and the English Church. And so today she's going to be talking to us about English mission in Venice at the very beginning of the 17th century. That august polity founded in late antiquity and hamstrung by Byzantine bureaucracy. The Church of England is still with us, but sadly the Republic of Venice is no longer. Eloise, I'll hand over to you, and you can give your talk, and then we'll have some time for some questions at the end.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for coming, everyone, and for enduring this now much more 17th century presentation with slightly updated printing technology, but still very much a print presentation, print era. Thanks very much for coming, and I will indeed be talking about England and Venice in the 17th century, and the question of whether the English attempt to convert Venice can be seen as some sort of first Anglican mission. Now, as you may have guessed, if you've read my title and seen the question mark, it was a slightly tongue-in-cheek suggestion that this is definitely the first mission, and meant to be a bit more of a provocative statement rather than a definite. But I think it is important to think about mission in the 17th century in a more detailed way, and to think about the Church of England's attempts to go about converting people and think it through sort of theoretically and what that meant. And recognise that the evangelical endeavours of the Church of England did not just start with the foundation of the Society for Promoting Christian Knowledge in 1698. So I am a historian of political thought, and particularly focused on early modern history by training. And in early modern history, one of the greatest growth areas in recent years has been the idea of global Christianity. Initially, scholars focused very much on the increasingly global reach of the Roman Catholic Church, especially the Jesuit missions, both within Europe and beyond Europe. But in recent years, there's also been increasing interest in the idea of global reformations too, and a question of what that means in general. But the 17th century Church of England, I think, still sits somewhat awkwardly in this picture. As a particular national church, it wasn't obvious that world evangelism was going to be a natural fit. But I think this is also what makes the case of the Church of England so interesting and distinctive. General histories of evangelism often focus more on this sort of later colonial era and the link between missionary activity and colonialism. But today I want to look earlier than this sort of well-known 19th century or even 18th century story, and think about the early 17th century as an era of missionary activity in the Church of England too. Now, clearly to talk about missionary activity in the Church of England in the 17th century is doing something quite different to thinking about it in the later period. And I hope to try and bring up some of those differences as well. It's not just a story of continuity. But I think it is important to remember this was an era in which patterns were set for a later period. And we might think of 17th century evangelical activities in the Church of England as a series of experiments, a laboratory, I think, for later missionary practice. So I'm going to be doing that in my talk today by focusing on this particular case of Venice in the early 17th century. And I'm going to be particularly focusing on the activities of the chaplain to the English ambassador to Venice in this first decade of the 17th century, the period especially 1607 to 1610. And the chaplain in that period was a man called William Bedell. So I'm going to give you an overview of Bedell's involvement in missionary activity in Venice, and then set his career in the context of some broader trends in the Church of England, and see what his career might tell us about the formation of the early Church of England in the Stuart period, as a missionary church more broadly. So by looking at the doctrinal and institutional underpinnings of 16th and 17th century evangelical endeavours, I want to try and tell a bit of a story about how one became a missionary in 17th century England. Okay, so let's meet William Bedell. Bedell was born in Black Notley, Essex in 1571. He was one of the first to matriculate at Emmanuel College, Cambridge, going up to the college within a year of its foundation in 1584. In 1593, he was elected the college's 14th fellow, and he swiftly took the college's mission to heart. He was later remembered as a part of a group of scholars who set on foot a design of preaching in places adjacent to Cambridge, even to a considerable distance. In early 1602, at the age of 30, Bedell left Cambridge to become a lecturer at St Mary's Church in Bury St Edmunds, Suffolk. As a lecturer at St Mary's, preaching the gospel was one of the most important parts of Bedell's clerical duties, a fitting job for someone trained at the newly formed Reformed College of Emmanuel. The high stock Bedell placed on the act of preaching was a central plank of his worldview, shaping decisions he made throughout his life. Bedell is best known today, however, for his later career, which took him far beyond Cambridge and Suffolk, first to the English embassy in Venice, and then later to Ireland, where he was Provost of Trinity College Dublin, and then Bishop of Kilmore. But it was in Venice that Bedell first took on the role of an agent of the church being abroad. So to start with, I want to give a brief outline of Bedell's activities there. He arrived in Venice in April 1607, and strange as it might seem to say today, this was a moment when observers across Europe really believed there was a real chance of Venice turning Protestant. A year before, in April 1606, a disagreement between Venice and the papacy about laws governing Venetian church property had led the Pope to declare an interdict, banning religious services across Venetian territory. The Venetians, led by the newly appointed state theologian, a man called Paolo Sarpi, defended themselves in a series of pamphlets which became admired across Europe. The controversy was viewed with particular sympathy in England, coming as it did just after the discovery of the Gunpowder Plot in November 1605. Several of Sarpi's pamphlets defending Venice against the papacy were translated and printed in London. Their central argument was asserting the jurisdictional supremacy of secular rulers against papal incursions. And this chimed perfectly with James VI I's post-Gunpowder Plot policies and writings. With anti-papal tensions running high in both states, the English ambassador to Venice, Sir Henry Wotton, sensed an opportunity to persuade the Venetians to make a permanent break with Rome. He turned to his newly arrived chaplain, William Bedell, to help him do this. Now, Venetian law banned senators and other high-ranking state officials from meeting socially with foreign diplomats. So this stipulation ensured that Wotton couldn't openly meet Sarpi and his broader anti-papal circles. But Bedell was a lower-profile member of the ambassador's household, and he consequently had more freedom. He started to regularly visit Sarpi and Sarpi's fellow Servite friar and close associate, Fulgenzio Mercanzio, on the pretext of teaching the two men English. The English ambassador's house was conveniently located next to the Church of San Girolamo in Cannaregio, only 5 minutes' walk from the Servite monastery in Venice, where both Sarpi and Mercanzio lived. And though neither Sarpi nor Mercanzio, nor indeed Venice as a whole, came to be converted to Protestantism in any straightforward sense at all, these meetings with Bedell did have important consequences. They gave rise to a flourishing of Anglo-Venetian exchange, which continued for over a decade. And the years 1607 to 1610, Bedell's period in Venice, also bore several more tangible fruits. Firstly, Bedell introduced Sarpi and Mercanzio to a wide range of reformed works of polemic. He introduced them to Calvin's Institutes, as well as other various works. He also used these works to develop a series of pamphlets written with Sarpi and Mercanzio, various short pieces of writing that would be published in various contexts later on. Bedell also helped Mercandio write a cycle of controversial Lent sermons, which Mercandio delivered in the church of San Lorenzo in Venice in spring 1609. And these meetings also led to various important translations. The three men collaborated on an Italian translation of Edwin Sand's Relation of the State of Religion, a travel account in which Sands offered an analysis of the differing churches of Europe. And they also wrote a series of notes to accompany this translation, reformulating it to put forward a particularly anti-papal vision, which it would hope would appeal to the Venetian nobility and to Catholics more broadly. And with the Servites' help, Bedell also produced the first Italian translation of the Book of Common Prayer, it was also hoped that this would form the basis for new forms of worship in Venice, which were shorn of what was seen as papal corruptions. Okay, so that's what was going on in this period in Venice. This is what might be called an English mission of some sort. Now, clearly, this English attempt to convert Venice to Protestantism in the wake of the interdict controversy raises several intriguing questions for the story of the Church in England abroad in this period. Can Wootton and Bedell's efforts be compared to the Catholic missions of this era? How far were the English aware of these Catholic efforts? How far were they developing a conscious response? Or were they trying to do something very different indeed? So I started thinking about these themes when I started to think about how what I saw to be a real reluctance on the part of the English in Venice to talk about what they were up to as a form of conversion. I think there's a real reluctance to use this term conversion in their writings. Very occasionally they do talk about conversion, but it's really not very often at all. Wootton is typical in instead discussing the progress of Reformation and steps of the truth in his letters. And Bedell too prefers alternative locutions, a change in religion, the spread of the truth, or, most frequent of all, his hopes for reformation. Bedell and Wootton's emphasis was on reforming Venice as a goal distinct from conversion. So, as you may all well know, as people interested in this history of the Church of England, this was a bit of a pattern in England too. It's well known that justifying the Henrician Reformation in England, people often talked about a return to past purity rather than novelty. They wanted to emphasise in Church of England apologetics that this was a reformation rather than a break into some sort of new church. And I think it's this same view that underpinned the English understanding of religious change in Venice that we see in these accounts. The English did not believe they were working to persuade the Venetians to change their religion entirely. Instead, they thought they were helping reform the Venetian church to remove popish corruptions. The goal was reformation within the existing church, not conversion to a new one. But nonetheless, I think this does join up to a broader story about conversion going on at this time across Europe and indeed beyond. What I think is particularly significant about this language is the way it allowed the English to defend their own evangelical endeavours against the work of their Roman Catholic rivals. I think the association between Jesuitism and conversion contributed to hostility to the term conversion amongst Reformed Protestants, who often preferred to describe religious change in other ways. The reported successes of the Jesuit missions in India and China fed into the Anglo-Venetian hostility to the Jesuits. The importance of this extra-European context for members of the English embassy in Venice has not often been noted. But I think it's clear that an awareness of the Jesuits' desire to characterise themselves as a missionary order fed into the fervent anti-Jesuitism of the English and Venetian anti-papal parties. Now, it's clear they were very anti-Jesuit. These sort of sovereignty-based polemics were often against what were perceived as Jesuit attempts to overthrow secular rulers at this time. The Jesuits were blamed for both the Gunpowder Plot, and they were ejected from Venice in the wake of the interdict controversy because they were seen as the order doing most to undermine secular power. But I think this was also joined up to a broader perception of what the Jesuits were doing around the world, and this attempt to assert a universal papal monarchy more broadly. So in Venice at the time, we find that Wootton mentioned the Jesuit claims to make converts in Russia and Africa, in the Venetian Collegio in May 1606. He described how he had read in certain news sheets that the Jesuits were making lots and lots of conversions there. But he noted to the Collegio at large that Russia and Africa were a very long way away, making these claims extremely difficult to verify. Wotton scornfully added that the Jesuits might as well have published the conversion, God forgive me, of some crocodile. Less flippantly, Wotton also wrote several detailed dispatches cataloguing the techniques the Jesuits used on English visitors to Italy, noting that the Jesuits had started to describe their work as the work of conversion, and noting that this had also been described as their essential difference from other orders. Now, the Jesuits in Moscow used in this speech was an example with which Wotton had close acquaintance, through his contact in Venice with the Jesuit diplomat and polemicist Antonio Posavino. Posavino had written a book, Moscovia, in which he set out an account of his visit to the court of Moscow in the hope of converting the Tsar to Catholicism. Wotton and Posavino met in Venice in 1604 to discuss King James's hopes for the institution of a church council to reconcile the differences of the Reformation. This had not come to fruit, but these two men were clearly in contact and trying to describe and trying to come up with shared ideas of the of how religious differences might be managed in Europe. But once once the interdict was declared, Posavino was one of those ejected, and he was roundly denounced by Wotton in the Collegio as one of the people who had done most to foment the opposition to the Venetian stance on the interdict. So the conversionary efforts of the Jesuits felt very close to home for both the English and the Venetians operating in Venice in this period. Posavino lived in Venice and Padua until the expulsion of the Jesuits in the wake of the interdict. And Sapio Macanzio's writings also display particular preoccupation with Jesuit activities in the Venetian Adriatic and Eastern Europe, where the Jesuits were blamed for undermining secular government. This was clearly something that was discussed between the English and the Venetians too. One of the pamphlets which Bedell brought back to England with him was a pamphlet blaming the Jesuits for instability in Poland in this period. As well as inspiring fear, however, the Jesuits could also inspire emulation. For Bedell, in Venice, it was clear that only Italian Protestants themselves had a real chance of effecting a Venetian Reformation. He helped formulate a plan for the establishment of seminaries in Italy to train up Italian Protestants as an answer to the missionary problem. The plan was presented to King James in England in 1609 and is still preserved in the state papers today. It directly states that such colleges would be modelled on the Jesuit colleges for Catholic Englishmen. So I think these models were clearly being discussed by the whole group. Evidence that Bedell took an interest in the Jesuits' extra-European missions can also be found in a letter which survives in a single transcribed copy at Lambeth Palace Library, addressed to Gasparo Despontino, a Venetian doctor that Bedell had brought back to Bury St Edmunds with him on his return from Venice. This is a very interesting and unusual document. Bedell, writing to a man who he had persuaded to join the Church of England about the latest news of Jesuit conversions. The purpose of Bedell's letter is to say how much he'd enjoyed reading a copy of the Jesuit Matteo Ricci's book on the Jesuit missions to China that Despotin had lent him. Bedell found it gripping reading, writing that he read it so repeatedly and avidly that sometimes I resented the announcement that dinner was ready, having already eaten too much of this history. Bedell goes on to explain that he did not think the Jesuits in China were sincerely preaching Christ. Rather, they were preaching for the amplification and domination of the Roman Pope, or for the ennoblement of their society. Consequently, he asserts that Jesuit conversion will instill idolatry and all types of papist superstition, more than the Christian faith in the Chinese. Nonetheless, Bedell did not see the Jesuit missions as entirely worthless. Quoting Paul, he says that it is always good for Christ's name to be preached, even if it is sung by hypocrites to further their own ends. In Italy, as we've seen, Bedell thought that there was still a true church labouring under the yoke of popish corruption. Similarly, Bedell believed that in the end, the truth of the gospel would shine through in China. The Jesuit superficial conversion efforts would pave the way for truer forms of religion, free of papal corruptions. God's word would out, in China as in the Republic of Venice. In other manuscript works, we also find Bedell taking an interest in Jesuit efforts for conversion in the Indies, interpreting these missions as further evidence, like those in China, of the risks of papal overreach. Bedell drew comparisons between the critics of the papacy in Spain and Italy, those who were rising up against the Spanish rule, and also those who opposed the imposition of Catholicism in the Americas, who, in Bedell's account, become proto-Protestants. So any indigenous resistance suddenly becomes a proto-Protestant movement. It's a move comparable to that which we see reformers in England using to recruit medieval heresies, the Waldensians, the Lollards, etc., as Protestant martyrs. Bedell was convinced that Spain's Amerindian subjects would soon see through the baser tincture, as he described it, of papalist Catholicism, and instead receive the richer dye of purer religion. It's a similar vision of this conversion by stages that we saw in that letter to Despottino. For Sarpi too, there were important lessons about papal overreach to be drawn from the comparison of the situation in Spanish America and that of Europe. He, like many modern historians, recognised that Spanish America acted as a testing ground where agents of the papacy could experiment with the most effective means of conversion before applying these lessons back in Europe. Writing to a French Huguenot correspondent in 1611, Sarpi describes his efforts to learn more about the Jesuit activities in the Americas, and also his fears about what this would mean for Europe in the long run. He passed on a report he had heard of the procedure of the Jesuit fathers in the Indies, where they were said to have openly asserted their domination. For Sarpi, this was a manifest indication of their plan to do the same in Europe, if they were able. Jesuit expansion then was being noticed by the order's opponents in both England and Venice, and with Bedell and Sarpi convinced that their efforts aimed at political domination rather than evangelism. Now, while on the theme of this response to the Jesuits, I also want to highlight this image you've all happily managed to have a copy of, which I think captures a lot about the way that Catholic expansionism shaped Anglo-Venetian thinking in this period. So this print was apparently first printed in Rome as a frontispiece attached to a book of theses in defence of papal power. Both Bedell and Sarpi sent copies of this print and detailed descriptions of its content to correspondents in England and France, because they viewed the print as particularly representative of the papacy's ambitions for a universal papal monarchy. And you can see in the middle, this is Pope Paul V, who declared the interdict, and he's surrounded by, well, we'll see what he's surrounded by in a minute, but he's obviously looking very grand there in the middle. So Bedell's interest in this print has attracted some attention because of his assertion that this print offers conclusive proof that the Pope is the Antichrist. Now, one of Bedell's reasons for this is the claim that is perhaps somewhat strange to modern ears, but was a popular way of determining these things at the time, that it's proved by the inscription, this Latin inscription here, which says Paolo vi Vici Deo, Paul V, vice God. Firstly, this confirmed the papacy's pride, which is important if you're looking for the Antichrist. But it also had a further providential proof, because if you add up the Roman numerals in this short inscription, you get, guess what? 666. There we go, ultimate proof. And a good game you can play on your own if you want to know who is the Antichrist. Get adding up those Roman numerals. But of course, this numbers game wasn't really that popular in Venice. This is not what Sarpi puts in his letters. And indeed, the doctrine of the Antichrist was one of the more difficult points between the English and Venice in this period. Nonetheless, Sarpi too sent round copies of this print as evidence of papal arrogance, without the description of the numbers. And Bedell and Sarpi's descriptions of the print both emphasise that the Pope of the image hangs secular rulers' crowns on the wooden surrounds to his portrait, as if displaying the spoils of war. And you can see, happily, in fact, on this version, I've circled it for you, the distinctive corner of the Venetian Doge, which is there on the left-hand side. And so you've got, on the left-hand side, these are supposed to be the sort of Western European monarchies. And then on the right-hand side, you see the sort of the Eastern rulers. And you've got a Muscovite crown, various turbans. So you've got all different sorts of crowns to represent the whole world, essentially. But what's more, going on with this vision of the sort of Pope ruling over the whole world, beyond these crowns, you've also got these four female figures. And on closer inspection, it becomes clear these are allegoric figures representing the four regions of the world: Africa, Europe, America, and Asia. And I think these figures, if I had the PowerPoint, maybe I'll show you a bit more. But there's a great work published in this time, Cesare Ripa's Iconologia, which was an illustrated idea of icons that represent certain ideas, which was published in its first illustrated version in Rome in 1603, so just at this moment. And you can map these on precisely to the vision of the regions in that work. You can see, starting on the left, we've got the vision of Africa. It's got the elephant and grain; those are the sort of decisive symbols. You've got Europe, a crown to represent this sort of knowledge of government and politics, a horn of plenty, a horse. And then we move across, we've got America, a feather headdress, a bow and arrow, and also by the feet of this figure for America, a head, which represents cannibalism, which was at that time seen as distinctive to the Americas. Then we've got Asia, which is holding incense and a camel. So we've got this whole vision of the sort of Roman propaganda, essentially at this time, showing the grandeur of Rome. And what's being taken from that by the Protestants is that this is so useful. They can actually spread this around, and this is doing more for them than it is for the Catholics. And in fact, this print, interestingly, is only survived because it's reprinted by Philippe du Plessis-Morny, known as the Pope of the Huguenots, who puts it on the front of his work about the papal Antichrist. And this is a copy of that. There's one other copy that I can't precisely work out which version it comes from, so it could be more original. But I haven't got one that's definitely from Rome. So the other question is, did they fake it? I don't think they did, because it ties up with other imagery of the time. But if anyone is an expert in these areas and has seen another copy of this, I'd love to know. So there we go. But what I think is very important is that this image shows how this papal idea of putting forward the vision of world evangelism is very powerful, and it does a lot to show that Catholicism is the true religion. It can win by numbers, but actually it's also then seized on by the Protestants, who want to twist that and say, no, actually this is proof that you don't want to be a sort of over the top arrogant Catholic trying to undermine secular authority and God's vision of politics. So the Venetian case during the interdict controversy had focused on these ideas of the papacy undermining secular jurisdiction. And this was a threat especially associated with the Jesuit order, which was seen to be intent on establishing papal universal monarchy. But the polemics of the interdict period also helped the Anglo-Venetian network come up with tools to think about global expansion. For Bedell and Sarpi, Jesuit missionary efforts, whether they aimed at the conversion of China, Spanish America, or Venice's own Adriatic Empire, were a pretext to further expand the Pope's claims of a universal empire. Thus, they justified and demanded an anti-papal response. Okay, So I'm aware I'm going on time, but so I think that's sort of what was going on in Venice and why I think it fits into this broader idea of missionary endeavour in the period. And I also wanted to extract two further themes about what Bedell's career tells us about the Church of England and evangelical endeavour in this period. And the first point I wanted to raise was the idea of the importance of educational institutions in this period. So Bedell's appointment as an ambassadorial chaplain in Venice is the best known of the Emmanuel College diplomatic appointments in the early years of James's reign. However, what I think is very interesting is it's not a standalone appointment, but part of a wider pattern. Emmanuel had been founded in the reign of Elizabeth by benefactors who wished to reform and improve English clerical education in the hope of creating a godly preaching ministry. But these initial aims of domestic reform soon broadened out, and the college seems to have found a role in European politics too. And I think this important role of the Jacobean colleges, the Cambridge colleges in Jacobean diplomacy and religious policy hasn't been fully recognised yet. But it's interesting because in some sense, the college has become the closest match for this sort of Jesuit college model before you get something like an institution set up specifically in Italy. And I think making this comparison would be interesting because what historians often point to as to why Catholicism takes off as a more widespread missionary faith in this period. Often people point to institutional shortcomings, and I think that's right, but we need to work out exactly what those shortcomings are. Why can't the Cambridge colleges really fill this gap? So Bedell's appointment we know about, but there were also several similar appointments for his Emmanuel contemporaries. In 1605, a man called James Wadsworth, with whom Bedell shared a chamber while he was at the college, was appointed chaplain to Charles Cornwallis on his embassy to Spain. And Wadsworth would in fact prove a less committed advocate of the Church of England abroad than Bedell. He converted to Roman Catholicism later on, and this sparked an extended correspondence with Bedell. Another of Bedell's friends at Emmanuel, Samuel Sotheby, travelled to Russia as chaplain to Sir Thomas Smith, with whom James had appointed special ambassador to the Tsar in 1604. And Sotheby is praised in Smith's account of the trip for his diligence in continuing to deliver sermons throughout their travels, even when he proved to be the member of the party who suffered most from seasickness. It's also possible to trace the interests of these Emmanuel men abroad through a number of publications which appeared in the wake of their travels, and all were printed for the same bookseller, a man called Samuel Mackham. So Thomas Smith's embassy had coincided with the seizure of power by the Romanov pretender in Russia, known as False Dimitri I, who confirmed the Muscovy Company's privileges in early 1605. An anonymous account of Dimitri's subsequent fall, printed in 1607 for Samuel Mackham, seems to have been printed on Sotheby's initiative. And soon after, Bedell would also draw this connection to Mackham, and he'd publish an account of an attempted assassination of Paolo Sarpi by papal agents. And both of these works call for support for a foreign power. In Sotheby's case, Dimitri, who was advised by Protestants, had supported English trade, and whom Sotheby thought had been toppled by Jesuit plotting. And in Bedell's case, obviously, Venice, which was standing up to the jurisdictional claims of the papacy. So I think we see this idea of sort of bringing different polities together, this alliance between different sort of perceived future national churches. So Emmanuel had been founded with this aim of furnishing the Church of England with well-educated godly preachers, but by the first decade of the 17th century, it was not only the English who were the targets of Emmanuel and men's evangelical efforts, they were also establishing themselves as players on a European religious stage. Bedell kept in close contact with friends in godly Cambridge during his travels, and he sent various pieces of information back to them. And we can trace an example of when he sent one to his friend Samuel Ward, future master of Sidney Sussex College, Cambridge, which was a work where Bedell sent answered a series of questions asked by Ward about sources in Venice for papal history, and these sources were directly inserted into King James's polemical works being written in that period. So there's quite a lot of overlap there. So beyond just becoming a training ground for godly preaching ministry at home and abroad, Emmanuel, Sidney Sussex and the so-called Puritan colleges of Cambridge, in fact, were becoming a training ground for theologians writing in support of the king in this era. So I think it's very interesting to see how James gets this sort of reformed conformist group to come behind him and defend his foreign policy. And we can think about this role that Emmanuel played in Jacobean policy in the context of other comparable institutions in Europe, particularly the Jesuit colleges, which would be a good case study for why Protestant and Catholic evangelism worked out so differently, and for how the church with a particular national identity, like the Church of England, could address the case of evangelism at all. And a final point I wanted to draw out was how William Bedell sort of brought some of these ideas that he was using in Venice back to England again, and how there was a sort of continuity in this period between thinking about the spread of evangelism at home and abroad. Throughout his career, Bedell drew on his experiences in one context and applied them to another. When he came back to Venice, to Suffolk from Venice, he was able to draw on his new experiences to sharpen his contribution to local religious debate. And amongst Bedell's surviving papers from this period, we find a volume of manuscript sermons. The sermons include a copy of the very first sermon that Bedell delivered on his return to Suffolk in early 1611, which takes as its text Psalm 95, "Oh, come let us sing unto the Lord," and which will have been delivered at the Church of St Mary in Bury St Edmunds in 1611. And here Bedell emphasises the themes of thankfulness to God, noting that beyond his general Christian obligation to thankfulness, he also had a particular reason for thankfulness for his return from Italy. He asked his converts to join him in giving thanks, saying, "If, as I persuade myself, you be joyful of my return, as I am glad to see your faces, let this joy be employed also in the manner of rendering praise to God for it." But what's interesting about this volume in particular, I think, is that it's a volume of sermons that's very closely linked to the liturgy of the Book of Common Prayer. 6 out of 9 of the sermons in this manuscript document are on psalms or gospel readings which feature in the services of morning or evening prayer. And it seems that the Book of Common Prayer continued to be a focal point of worship for Bedell, continuing some of the themes we saw with his translation in Venice. And in his Suffolk sermons, he continues to insist that the Reformed Church of England should be defined against papal excess and corruption, but also against excessive separatist purity. And he seems to have seen the Book of Common Prayer, I think, as a way you could come together aside from these differing poles, and base it not in some sort of middle way, but on some active identity that is held in this national liturgy. And this call for both reformation of corruptions and loyalty to the ceremonial forms prescribed by the secular ruler echoes the stance that Bedell had advocated in Venice. Indeed, Bedell's sermons have echoes of the sermons he helped Mercanzio write. We can also see echoes of Bedell's activities in Venice and other writings of the period, such as a short tract which he wrote straight after his return from Venice in 1611 and dedicated to Lady Anne Drury, a local Suffolk godly hostess with whom Bedell was clearly well acquainted. Bedell explains in the preface to this work that Drury had requested that he write it for a Catholic friend of hers who had asked for more information about Protestantism. What's really notable about this text is the overlap between the points he puts forward and those that he'd set out in the notes to that work by Edwin Sandys that he had helped Sapio Mercanzio write in Venice. Bedell clearly thought that the arguments he'd made in Venice retained their power in Suffolk. Following several years in Suffolk, in 1627, Bedell was once again asked to take up a new and challenging post, this time in Ireland, where he was appointed Provost of Trinity College Dublin and then Bishop of Kilmore. Like Venice, this was a role involving close contact with Catholics, but unlike Venice, it was in a colonial context. Bedell was initially reluctant to be sent to Ireland, expressing his satisfaction in Suffolk and his hope he might continue to be useful in building connections with Venice. But he also commented that if it was the will of God, he was willing to close his eyes against his own conveniencies and follow God's call, not only into Ireland, but also to Virginia, even if he risked death in the process. It seems Bedell recognised the connection between the shared goals of the Church of England across various missionary contexts, although he did recognise that some contexts were more challenging than others. In Ireland, Bedell would deploy many of the same techniques he'd used to promote reform in Venice, including spearheading the first translation of the Old Testament into Irish. This time, however, he faced opposition from his own side. James Ussher, Archbishop of Armagh, warned him that his course with the Papists was generally cried out against for helping confirm the Irish Catholics in their superstition and idolatry. Though Ussher himself saw some value in Bedell's schemes, his comments reflect a clear concern amongst the broader Anglo-Irish community about Bedell's indulgence towards the Irish Catholics, and these were clearly complaints bound up with fears of disobedience and rebellion. In the potentially volatile colonial context, certain members of the Anglo-Irish elite preferred non-comprehending ceremonial conformity from Irish churchgoers, rather than the careful consideration of Reformed doctrine that Bedell liked to advocate. In some sense, they could be accused of enacting much the same shallow approach to conversion that Bedell had critiqued in the Jesuit missionaries, a point which Bedell made, and did not make him many more friends, I think. So he did have this difficult time trying to apply different things. His translation of the Old Testament to Irish was coordinated in the 1630s, but it wasn't printed by the time of Bedell's death in 1642. However, it was not forgotten. It was printed in 1685 thanks to the late 17th century Archbishop of Armagh, Narcissus Marsh. Marsh coordinated with friends in London, including the Anglo-Irish scientist Robert Boyle, to have it printed. The process was not entirely straightforward, with progress slowed by further edits, and also a comic incident in which Boyle's assistant accidentally burnt a letter from Marsh during an experiment. In 1685, however, the work was finally complete, and 500 copies were printed. Now, Boyle was actively involved in a wide range of missionary projects, contributing financially to initiatives for the propagation of the gospel in the Americas and the Levant. The publication of the Irish Old Testament was part of this broader effort. By this time, with translation initiatives increasingly popular, Bedell was starting to look like a man far ahead of his time, and the 1680s and 90s saw a more general resurgence of interest in Bedell and his mission to Venice in general as a historical occasion. In 1685, the very same year which saw the Irish Old Testament published, we also see the publication of a biography of Bedell, written by the future Bishop of Salisbury and later architect of the 1688 Revolution, Gilbert Burnet. And we also see in that year the publication of the first printed version of an Italian translation of the Book of Common Prayer, which may have in part been based on Bedell's earlier translation, and was at the very least associated with Bedell's efforts in Venice at the time in the description of those events in its preface. Bedell and his associates in Venice then had become part of what was essentially an Anglican canon, which provided a model on which future missionary work could draw. And that brings me to a few words of conclusion. The English attempt to turn Venice Protestant in the wake of the Indict controversy is one of the better known attempts to effect a large-scale conversion within 17th century Europe. It was in many ways an idiosyncratic moment, but I think it also points towards some general trends in the 17th century Church of England. And there's three main points I think we can draw away from it, that we can take away from it and think about more in future. Firstly, I think it raises interesting questions about what represented success for the Church of England in terms of evangelism in the 17th century. Bedell's measure of success makes the Venice effort much more successful than might seem to us today. Reform could be internal rather than external, and there could be a sense in which someone like Sarpi and Macanzio were in fact living the life of reformers on Bedell's view of it. I think it also raises questions about the history of institutions and their role in evangelical endeavour in the 17th century Church of England. It seems there was a conscious effort to shape sort of godly institutions as a response and rival to Jesuit colleges, and to pursue ambitious schemes for the establishment of new colleges that would be even better suited to the propagation of the Church of England and similar models abroad. And though efforts like the idea of colleges in Italy don't come to fruition, they were clearly thinking about these things and thinking about them comparatively.
And finally, I think it raises the question of the story of emulation and differentiation from the Jesuits. It's clear that English efforts in Venice took place within the context of Catholic expansion. It seems that English conceptions of conversion were formed in opposition to the vision of conversion put forward by their Jesuit rivals. Working alongside other members of the Anglo-Venetian anti-papal network, Bedell helped draw out a particular understanding of conversion opposed to that set forth by papal and especially Jesuit polemicists. By supporting a reformed national church shorn of papal excess and corruption, the English and Venetians could cooperate across confessional lines, while still remaining loyal citizens of their own states. This was a political model that was going to be useful both politically and religiously for many years to come. Thank you very much for listening.